This is the Interested Interview. I am your host, JJ Clarke, and today we're going to talk about alcohol and Ireland. And to help me with that is Head of Communications and Advocacy at Alcohol Action Ireland, Eunan McKinney. Eunan, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, JJ.
No problem at all. What is a public health approach to alcohol harm, and the one that is advocated by Alcohol Action Ireland?
Well, essentially, Alcohol Action Ireland is an independent advocate for reducing alcohol harms in society. You know, from a visionary point of view, we would like to seek an Ireland where society was free from alcohol harm. And in that context, you know, laced throughout that is embedded a whole series of public health endeavours and messaging around trying to improve what are the poor public health outcomes that result from our relationship with and our use of alcohol. You know, what we would be advocating for is undoubtedly a series of regulations and controls whereby we would put in place a series of curbs on the demand for alcohol. So we very much approach it from a frame that society did around tobacco throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, whereby over a period of a couple of decades, we began to understand the harm that was associated with tobacco use. And over time, we put in place a series of measures whereby the consumption and the use of tobacco essentially fell from nearly 50% across the population to today, where we have nearly around 16 or 17% of the population using tobacco. And, so obviously the income and the impact on the broader public endeavour around health has obviously improved immensely as a result of that. So there's less people dying, obviously, from lung cancer. There's less people dying from cardiovascular-related illnesses, and a whole series of other related harms to others that tobacco caused. And so alcohol is in a very similar space. In Ireland, every year we're losing over 2,700 people to alcohol-related illnesses and incidents. And the cost to the public exchequer of managing that harm and trying to deal with the impacts throughout the public system is around 3.6 billion. So we have we have an enormous. That's just kind of the headline stuff. Well, obviously it's much broader implications for the level of alcohol use that we have in this country.
Right, and before we dive into, I suppose, the alcohol harm as a kind of banner heading, I just want to look at the history of alcohol, because it strikes me as the image that Ireland has as a large consumer of alcohol. Even on your website, you have that alcohol consumption from the 1960s onwards has trebled up until 2018, which to me is, as someone in their 20s who's come up in Ireland, I thought that Ireland historically consumed a lot of alcohol. But can you go into the history of Ireland becoming known as a big consumer of alcohol? Like, where did that come from?
Well, I think there's two sides to that story. I mean, historically, I think Ireland has been, and the Irish have been characterised for their drunkenness and for the correlated activity of fighting. The drunken fighting Irish, and largely that's a concept that was really constructed around political and social prejudice. It is something that was founded largely in Victorian England and North America in terms of the prejudice that there was around Ireland, and so it became a kind of a caricature, but also a highly laced political term to ensure that that idea of the slovenly, lazy, useless Irish were largely associated with drunkenness, and that kind of fed into a popular narrative that largely we see certainly expressed in film and art throughout the 20th century, certainly in the middle half of the 20th century. So you just think Quiet Man, as a classic example of that typical stereotypical presentation of Ireland, the great fighting scene that there is, the pubs, all that in the Quiet Man. That almost captures it in many ways perfectly. But then what happened from the 1960s. In tandem with that, obviously, throughout the 20th century in Ireland, we did have largely a theocracy, whereby the rule of high morality, the influence of the Catholic Church, piety, pioneer movement, Father Matthews, all of that sort of thing. Those trends obviously made sure that there was a mass sign up by population to issues of temperaments. So you have those two things running in tandem, and then by the time you get into the 1960s and the whole expansion of the opening of the Irish economy from what was a closed economy, all the levers all the classes that were around alcohol in terms of its control and its keeping demand down, all of those are loosened, and then by the time Ireland joins the European Union, or as it was the EEC in the early 1970s, well, the whole race of liberalisation took place right across into the 1970s, into the 1980s, until you get to a point around 2000, at the turn of the century, whereby we are now in a complete hedonistic days where we're drinking nearly 14.5 litres of pure alcohol per person.
Which is an absurd amount of alcohol.
That's kind of the quick history of it in that sense.
You have an education background. You have a career experience in politics, but you have, which would expose you to, I suppose, the lobbying that takes place on behalf of the alcohol industry. But then you have the advertising education background. And does that put you in a particular vantage point where you can say, I see what they're doing there, or what's happening here?
Well, absolutely, and I think in my experience and my research, if you look at the whole movement of advertising of alcohol through the 1970s and into the 1980s, you can see how we transformed the whole landscape in relation to advertising and promotion from what was a very utilitarian approach. In other words, here's the beer, here's the whiskey, here's the price of it, here's where it was made, here's how it looks, etc. We moved from that kind of point of selling a commodity to incorporating alcohol into what were new brand relationships, what we understand today as brand relationships. And that whole relationship building with an audience and a cohort around alcohol so that people can feel better, think that they look better, feel that they're part of a crowd, part of a movement, all of those sort of instruments of marketing came to place from the 1970s onwards, and you can track that through. Certainly, if you look at the historical advertising presence of some of the beer products, you can see that development as it has taken place, and that's largely where we're at today. We're now at a point whereby in Ireland we have certainly 1.4 million people who have a harmful use of alcohol on a regular basis. And we have a whole legion of alcohol consumers who largely will run to defend any instrument that's put in place to try and curb the demand of alcohol. So it's been a highly effective brand relationship development by the alcohol companies into the Irish population. And the worst part of that is that we see essentially, by the time the cohort of children today hit the end of their teenage years, we have 93 out of 100 of those kids drinking alcohol. And that's not because when they got to the age of 18, the tap was just, or some trigger switch went off in their head to say we want alcohol. It's because they've been fostered into a relationship with the alcohol brands from a very early age. And that's been done through sports sponsorship, through arts and culture sponsorship, and then eventually into direct advertisement towards them.
To a point where I suppose you have a situation where if you go out on a night out and you're over 18 and you're not drinking, people are like, well, what's the crack? Are you doing dry January? Or, it's that kind of idea, which is a little bit scary. And now I suppose, could we look at the public harm? So we have like the nuisance factor, Temple Bar on a busy weekend, the police being called, people driving while under the influence, fatty liver disease. Can you just go into that a little bit?
Obviously, we spoke earlier about the social and economic cost to the public exchequer, which is around 3.7 billion. So what does that look like? Well, where does that money get spent? Well, obviously, the vast majority of it gets spent in our public health system. So the hospitalisation in relation and the primary care of people who are suffering from not necessarily alcoholism or dependency, but also acute alcohol episodes. So typically the people who run into the A&Es every Friday, Saturday and Sunday night in Ireland, around 30% of the people going into the A&Es are there because of alcohol-related episodes. So people who fall, trip, fall into rivers, all these sort of activities that take place. And obviously, from a death point of view, we see, episodes, all those episodes that we hear about in terms of fire episodes, mortality and fire episodes, half of those are related to alcohol. Half the pedestrians that are killed in Ireland, all are related to alcohol. So they're the sort of those sort of costs at a really primary level in terms of health. Obviously, we're contributing massively to the rise of cardiovascular diseases. We're obviously contributing significantly to a growth of gastroenteritis issues, cancers. We know that in cancer-related matters, 1 in 8 breast cancers in females is directly related to alcohol consumption. We know that over the last 40 years, mortality from liver disease has increased by 400%. Liver cirrhosis in the last 30 years amongst men has increased by 25%, women 150%. So these are the major sort of impacts that we can see on our public health system. And then beyond that, obviously, which is one of the great paradoxes I always think about, how the business enterprises and business associations are so keen to promote the alcohol industry. The level of cost that is borne by Irish business in relation to alcohol and the use of alcohol through absenteeism, through loss of productivity. And at the core of that is obviously a whole unknown loss of creativity and enterprise itself. As I say, we have a whole cohort of young people who are entering into working life, and 93 out of 100 of them are drinking alcohol. And of those, nearly a quarter are doing so on binge level drinking. So we've almost decided as a society that we're going to just write off the capacity of a huge number of people so that we can sell them alcohol.
I suppose on the continent, particularly I have friends from France, and they don't drink to get drunk per se, but that was definitely a feature of my youth and the culture around drinking when I was younger, and I still think it is today.
Yeah, I think it's because we normalize alcohol as an everyday commodity. We think that it's perfectly acceptable, and we have no understanding. There's very little understanding of what is a low risk approach to consuming alcohol. And historically, I think through that period, as I say, of liberalisation in the 1970s into the 1980s and the 1990s, then we're fueled by an economic boom that allowed even greater activity. So we've largely continued to support any idea of excessive alcohol consumption, and we have an alcohol industry who spend approximately 150 million euros in Ireland on promotion and marketing and sponsorship of alcohol. So, what does that? I mean, that is obviously a huge amount of money. But more importantly, what it means is that in any one instance of whereby someone like the HSE, or largely the HSE, who may spend a very small amount of money on any health promotion messaging around alcohol, it gets completely drowned out by the messaging that's associated with alcohol, which is largely a risk-free promotion. It's like there's no endeavour to show you what the harm of alcohol is. Any promotion around alcohol is entirely joyful, pleasurable, humorous. It's an activity that everybody would want to be seen to be involved with, and that's exactly what happens, And just to go back on your economic point, there is a view, of course, which is a myth perpetuated again by the alcohol industry, that the alcohol industry is somehow fundamental to their Irish existence. It's fundamental to the enterprise and economic success of Ireland. Well, in actual fact, it is not. I mean, if you look at the national export and import goods of alcohol from Ireland, alcohol sales or alcohol exports contribute just over 1%, 1% of our national exports. So, we really have a case of the tail wagging the dog here.
When people were at home drinking a lot and there was no measures, it was just self-pour measures, that the instances of domestic violence shot through the roof. You have a situation where it's really hard to track, but mental health, if you're drinking, Friday, Saturday, Sunday even, more than a certain amount, you're going to have a knock-on effect into next week. You're going to have lethargy. You're going to have all these knock-on effects. But it was particularly in focus during lockdown, I thought.
Yeah, well, during the lockdown, obviously, what the first thing that occurred, one of the major things that occurred, was obviously the licensed premises were closed, and essentially what that meant was that, for the vast majority of people who have this relationship with alcohol, this use of alcohol, it meant that one of the primary centres for consuming it was closed, and that cut off about 35%. Where we drink our alcohol, about 35% of it is drank in licensed premises. So then what happens is that cohort of people who were drinking their alcohol in licensed premises had to find their alcohol somewhere else. And I say had to because, when you have that level of a harmful relationship with alcohol, you do actually really want to get your alcohol. So, what we saw is over certain spikes of the corona or the COVID-19 crisis, we saw off-license and off-sales spike by 90% at one point, even 50%, 55%, week on week. And so what has largely happened is that the activity of consuming alcohol has largely poured into our homes. And the difficulty, as you say, with that has been, and we have been campaigning around this since the beginning and alerting people that this was going to be the case, is that the levels of alcohol pouring into our homes and then being consumed in an unregulated, free-flowing way is undoubtedly going to impact greatly, not just on the immediate health of people, but also in the long term, because what are temporary behaviours can become long-term habits. And the other factor that obviously, as you spoke about, is the level of harm to others. Like we, in our work and our advocacy work on our day-to-day basis, speak to the terrible situation that 200,000 children are living with every day, whereby they have to cope and struggle with parental alcohol misuse in the home. So what do we think the impact on those children has been over the last 12 or 14 weeks? And what will be the outcome? Of course, the outcome will be that those children, the adverse childhood experiences that those children are been enduring, will be worse. And therefore, you're absolutely right. We will see down the line very shortly, we will see significant impact from this particular COVID event and this public crisis, the public health crisis. We will see a huge spike in demand for mental health services and related matters.
And as well, I think it's really important to point out when you're having a conversation like this is that the alcohol isn't the evil itself. It's the system around it that's created this petri dish of, result. It's not just, you can, I suppose, it's not the actual object itself. It's just the system and, I suppose, the consumerism aspect of it and the more and more excessive culture around it.
It's the unfettered experience that we have with alcohol. We have sadly, reluctantly, never sought to really control the level of alcohol that we're consuming in Ireland. And what we have done in recent times is we have, thankfully, we obviously had a role to play in this. In 2018, we did pass the Public Health Alcohol Act, which was for the first time, historically the first time, that alcohol was been treated as a public health matter, as a public health problem. Heretofore, alcohol has always been legislated by as a matter of criminal justice. It's always been in the Department of Justice and places like that. So this act sought to bring about a set of measures which would curb the demand for alcohol and reduce alcohol consumption, hopefully by 20% over a 7-year period. Now, sadly, that act, while it was passed, the principal measures that are contained in it, like matters of minimum unit pricing, which would ensure that the strongest, cheapest alcohol in our off-license could not be sold beneath a certain price. So minimum pricing, the content of advertising, which would transform how alcohol is advertised in Ireland, the labelling of alcohol products, which would clearly state the risk to one's health and the direct link between alcohol and fatal cancers, would be on every product. Those measures and others haven't been commenced, and we have very little visibility as to when they will be commenced. So again, we see all the time industry knocking on the door of government trying to prevent what are proven evidence-based public health measures being implemented. And in fact, during the COVID crisis, there's one particular measure which is supposed to come into operation in November, whereby alcohol is separated in our stores. It took the alcohol industry 1 week from the beginning of the COVID crisis to be writing letters to the Minister for Health and the Minister for Business, citing that they should stall and delay that action because of the cost to business. So again, we see all the time, to your point about lobbying, they're constantly trying to prevent any measure that will curb the demand for alcohol. So and I don't criticize them necessarily for this, because that is their business. Their business is to sell more, not less. And if we have a society whereby we allow them more to be unfettered, well, then we will get what we are getting, which is 1.4 million people suffering from, having a harmful relationship with alcohol, 7% of those dependent on alcohol, 200,000 children living with parental alcohol misuse on a daily basis. This is the outcome. And do we want to do something about it, or do we just want to continue to live with this?
And just on, I suppose, evidence-based solutions, and maybe not solutions isn't the best word for it, but like countermeasures, and what countries out there are taking it seriously and are treating it as a public health issue? And is there any kind of examples that you can cite that of tactics that could work? I know you're big on pricing.
Well, there's I suppose the context I'd say to you is that we have to remember that Western Europe, in the context of the theatre that we live in, the Western Europe democracies are essentially the highest drinking consumers of alcohol in the world, and many of those countries over the last 2-3 decades have endeavoured to bring about a situation whereby their consumption of alcohol, because of the harm to their society, the public health harms, have sought to bring about a reduction. So if you go back to look at Italy, for example, so you cited Ireland in the 1960s, we were drinking 6 litres per capita. Today we're drinking 11. In Italy in the 1960s, they were drinking 14 litres per capita. Today they're drinking 7. So they have halved their consumption of alcohol over the periods of time that we've trebled ours. France, similarly, they have reduced their consumption by over 25%. And they have done so largely by virtue of bringing about a set of measures that have curbed the demand by introducing strict regulations in marketing and promotion. In the Nordic countries, historically, they have always had curbs. They have had significant, they have a state monopolistic situation on the sale of alcohol, so it's in particular licensed stores, restricted hours of access, etc. Those measures are there. And then more laterally, we see across the water, as you say, we're interested particularly in price, because we know that the evidence on restricting price is important. So Scotland, in the last year and a half, have introduced minimum unit pricing, which the alcohol industry prevented from happening for 6 years. And they've seen a steady reduction in relation to the sale of alcohol.
Just for the listeners' union, what is minimum unit pricing?
Okay, so minimum unit pricing legally puts a price on a gram of alcohol, and it essentially means that you cannot sell an alcohol product, for less than what the total of the gram priceage is. So, typically, if minimum unit pricing was to come in, a standard drink with it would be at €1. So it's 10. Essentially, there's 10 grams of alcohol in a standard drink. So that would mean that typically at the moment you can buy in supermarkets, convenience stores, etc. You can buy a bottle of spirits, gin, vodka, whiskey for somewhere around 14, 15, 16, 17, in around that sort of price. With minimum unit pricing, which, a bottle of whiskey, 700 CL at 40% ABV, essentially that has 220 grams of alcohol in it. Therefore, that cannot be sold for less than 22 euros. So a slab of beer, typically at the moment, a slab of beer, 24 500 milliliters of beer, currently on the market, probably somewhere around 24, 25 euros. They wouldn't be able to be sold for that because they would now be 36, 37 euros.
What is the next action step of the ones you just mentioned there that Ireland are going to be pushing for? Is it just going to be the plethora of options, or is it going to be one in particular that you're really driving for?
Well, the central one that we're driving for is minimum unit pricing, and that has been held up in a kind of a feigned political discourse around whether we should or shouldn't introduce it in tandem with Northern Ireland. And again, there's a series of spurious arguments been put forward by the alcohol industry that it'll drive, purchase of alcohol across border, which we don't particularly buy. And if alcohol was available at the minimum unit pricing, whereby, as I say, those cheap, strong alcohol products couldn't be sold beneath a certain price, it is likely that we could see an 8% reduction in alcohol consumption. Now, that's a significant prize. Remember, I said we were trying to bring about a 20% reduction over 7 years. So the value of minimum unit pricing as a public health measure is enormous, and there's a real driver of positive outcomes. The second thing that's likely that we're going to be pushing for, and again, the previous Minister for Health, delayed this somewhat, is the provision of proper labelling of alcohol products, whereby there are clear warnings in relation to the risk to your health, and in particular the risk of alcohol-related cancers.
Would that be similar to the cigarette companies, that they would have an image on the back?
No, it wouldn't be a graphic. It wouldn't be a graphic information panel. It would be a wording matter. It would just simply state it, which it doesn't at the moment. Like at the moment, if you buy any product, a non-alcoholic beverage, you will get a whole list of ingredients. You'll get a whole list of the calorie information. All of those items are legislated for through the EU directives in relation to what we should display on products. We don't have that for alcohol products. It's exempt from that. And the reason it's exempt is because, of course, the alcohol industry don't want you to know what's inside that product and the harm that it's causing you. So what this act does, and this is legislated, is the law of the land that hasn't been commenced, is that every alcohol product in the future will have clear warnings established on it conspicuously to say this product is of harm to your health, and there is a direct link between it and fatal cancers.
Okay, Eunan, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.